All right, real happy to be joined by my next guest here on Sports Card Nation. He's been on my list to get on the show, and since we went to two episodes, like double episodes, we get less guests on each month. So that it's taken me a little bit. That's on me, but glad to have him on. Mr. Drake McGruder, welcome to Sports Card Nation.
Hey, John, thanks. Thank you very much for having me on. I'm a longtime listener, first time caller, as they say in the radio business. So I've long been a fan of your show, and I'm excited to be on.
Well, I appreciate the kind words and glad you're here. Again, kind of, first time on, hopefully not the only time on, and we'll have you back again. But being the first time on, it's kind of the standard fair opening question, right? How did we get here? Where did it all start for young Drake to where we are now? But where did the hobby first start for you?
Yeah, so when I was, I don't know, 5, 6 years old, my aunt, and just for background for listeners, I grew up in the Memphis area, hence my love for wrestling, which we'll talk about in just a bit. But so my aunt for my birthday gifted me some of her old, like, 60s and 70s football and baseball cards and all that kind of stuff. And I didn't really know much about them. I just thought they were really cool photos. And then I would flip through and I would see some names of people that I knew, and I looked to read the back and all that, and I was like, "Well, this is kind of neat." And she gave them to me in a binder, which I still have, by the way. I still have all the cards that she gave me. And just to say, that's a philosophy that I have. If someone ever gives me a card, I never get rid of it. Right, like that's a gift and that whole sort of thing. And so that was my first kind of experience into cards. But then growing up as a kid, we had several hobby shops where I grew up, just outside of Memphis. And whenever you got good grades on your report card or you did good in whatever, that was kind of what my parents and some of my friend parents would do to recognize that accomplishment. We would go to the hobby shop and either get some packs of cards or a box of cards, because back then, you get a box of cards for $50 or whatever, right?
Yeah,
And
the good old days.
yeah, exactly. And so we would bust through the cards, and you would, try to find the players you like. I remember in the early '90s, it was like everybody wanted, Chris Webber and Nick Van Exel, and on the basketball side and that whole sort of stuff. And then you'd trade with your friends, and you'd go with your next door neighbors and just kind of, trade and that whole sort of thing. And it was, it was fun to read about the players, and then all of a sudden you'd pull out this card, and you'd be like, wow, this is really cool. And then you would run and check out the Beckett and see the price. And then the next month it either had the up arrow or the down arrow and that whole sort of thing. So that's kind of what got me started into the hobby.
Yeah, no doubt. And it's funny how the hobbies change, but there's still some things that, have remained the same. You mentioned wrestling. Let's kind of tackle that off the bat. You know, I watch wrestling. I wouldn't say I'm a wrestling fan. I know the names. My son had a probably a 4 to 6 year period where he was really big into it. We went to some live events, even a pay per view in Pittsburgh. We've seen strides. It's always been pop. It's always been popular as a sport outside the trading card sphere. That's never been a question. But we've seen the rise in popularity when we're talking about the hobby space, with people collecting it, getting into it. Kind of, your for like, what was it for you, and how do you see it? Where the wrestling hobby is today? Maybe even comparably speaking to where it was.
Yeah, so just kind of some background. Like I said, I grew up in the Memphis area. Wrestling was big around Memphis with Jerry Lawler and the folks that came up through the scene on their way to the World Wrestling Federation or WCW or kind of wherever they went. And so, just about every Monday night, my dad was taking me down to the Mid South Coliseum, and we'd watch the wrestling matches, and I would get programs signed by people, and that whole sort of thing. And then you'd go to the Monday Night Raw or Monday Nitro, and you'd get, T-shirts or belts and all that sort of stuff and everything. And that was kind of my experience into wrestling, or like getting into wrestling. And you would have like Monday Night Raw and Nitro watch parties, and you'd grill out with your friends, and which I'm sure my parents just loved, right? Having a bunch of kids over to, watch wrestling, and then they're the ones having to do all the cooking and clean up and that whole sort of thing. And And then my friends and I, we'd develop these little neighborhood wrestling leagues on the trampoline. And, we'd go down to Home Depot and get trash cans and tables and ladders and shoot off fireworks. And sometimes we would set the yard on fire because I learned quickly you don't light a firework in the middle of December with a bunch of brown grass. And, and so we did the whole wrestling thing. I mean, we were eaten up with wrestling, and it just kind of, it continued through college and that whole sort of thing. And I would keep up with it sometimes more than others. I know in college, sometimes they would show like the pay-per-views at either like a Hooters or a Buffalo Wild Wings or whatever. And that was just a way for some buddies to get together and go watch the event, have some drinks, some wings, stuff like that. And that was just a good way to bond. And so it just kept going on. And then I got married. And I think my wife thought she could change me, like, oh, this is just a phase that he's going through. He's going to grow out of it. And I often tell her, I said, you can take the boy out of Memphis, but you can't take the Memphis out of the boy. And so I just kept on with wrestling and kept watching it. And, it's a big soap opera, as they all say. It kind of progresses and keeps building. And then, just when you think like, okay, I'm not really feeling it much anymore, they'll bring back The Rock or somebody like that, or Stone Cold Steve Austin. And you're like, man, that's really cool. That drives the nostalgia. And so when I look over my shoulder, I've got some like signed wrestling boots of, Hulk Hogan and Ric Flair and The Undertaker and that sort of stuff. So I had like wrestling memorabilia, and I didn't even know cards existed. And then, back after getting into the hobby back in 2019, a little while after that, I was really enamored with kind of the shiny cards and that sort of thing. And I was actually listening to the old Lucas Tigers and Bronze podcast, and they had a guy, I think he was their first guest actually, named David Peck, that came on. And he started talking about a set called the 1982 Wrestling All-Stars. And I was like, what is he talking about? I didn't even know wrestling cards existed. And I reached back out to my hobby shop back home, and I said, hey, like when I was growing up, did you guys have wrestling cards? And they said, no, like we knew about them, but we tried. They said they got them in, but nobody wanted them. And so they didn't restock, right? And so I was like, well, this is kind of cool. So I got in and I started to look at it, and I was like, well, that's kind of cool. There's these 82 All-Stars, and oh gosh, there's Hulk Hogan, and there's Ric Flair and Jerry Lawler. There's Andre the Giant, a whole bunch of other names. So then that just kind of started down kind of like, well, gosh, there's cards in the 80s. And then, well, there's more wrestling cards in the 90s. Well, this is kind of cool. And then around that same time, my friend Brett McGrath, who is known as Stacking Slabs, he was like, hey, Drake, did you know, like, because he and I both kind of like similar type stuff in Peyton Manning and wrestling. He said, did you know 2014 Topps Chrome has like these gold refractors? And I was like, really? And he goes, yeah, and you can get the Rock gold refractor for like $70. I'm like, well, that's kind of cool too, And so he and I went, and we were just buying up any name we saw. It was Rock, Triple H, John Cena, to Hulk Hogan, to Undertaker. We're just buying gold refractors and that whole sort of thing. And, that's really what got me back into whole like collecting wrestling cards. Is I was like, well, this is kind of cool because, I like wrestling. I like shiny cards. I like the vintage cards too. I mean, I still had plenty of those like sitting around, but I was like, this is something that just, it appeals to me a lot. And seeing the photography on some of the cards, takes you back to moments. Nostalgia is very big for me. And so it's been great to, get back into wrestling cards and, really see where they were, largely ignored for so long. And then they have the shiny stuff, and then Panini comes into play in 2022. And then there's just this rush of people to it. And all of a sudden the values just went crazy insane. And then we've seen that kind of continue on now back to the Fanatics and Topps era. And there's so many more people in wrestling cards now than there were just, think about 5 years ago. Sometimes 5 years seems like a long time. It's really not that long of a time. And, the explosion in wrestling cards and in the community around wrestling cards has been really great to see.
Yeah, no doubt. And I found it interesting that you're in sort of a wrestling hotbed, but that the cards never really was part of that. What do you attribute maybe that? Why not the cards? It just people didn't know they like yourself. They just didn't know they existed, and it was sort of out of sight, out of mind.
Yeah, I think that was part of it. I think, and I'm gonna answer this not knowing exactly, but I think maybe the accessibility may not have been good. For example, like the 82 Wrestling All-Star sets, they came from a magazine. It was like a mail order thing. You had to send it in and they would send you the package of cards or whatever. So it wasn't like distributors had them, in droves. And, and I think on like the 2014 Topps Chrome set, fast forward a little bit, I think there were only like, I don't know, I forget how many cases, but not that many cases compared to what you see in other sets. And so I think just the access to them was not much. But I spoken a little bit previously. Is what's interesting is that wrestling fans have long always spent lots of money to get the belts and the signed belts. And I remember going as a kid, and I just wanted like a T-shirt that said "suck it" across it, or whatever for DX, and it was like $25. And my dad was like, "Son, that is way too much for a shirt." Which A, it was. B, I'm thankful he didn't let me wear a shirt with "suck it" across the front because that's something that I wouldn't let my son do now. So, but you would just go to those merchandise stands, and even you see it now at wrestling events. Because I actually took my son to one a SmackDown not too long ago over in Tulsa, Oklahoma, and the line just wraps around those merchandise stands, and you're going, these people are spending just enormous amounts of money on this stuff that is cool to have, but eventually the T-shirt's going to wear out, or you're going to outgrow it, or the little chain that someone's wearing or whatever is going to get sold at a garage sale or whatever. But they are just making a killing on merchandise sales and things of that nature, which is great to them. But I've often wondered, it's like, well, why did people like okay with spending that much money on that, but they're not okay or they don't spend as much money on the wrestling stuff? And I think it's just the whole accessibility to the product, number one, which is a lot better now. And then I think accessibility to the superstars. And so I think, the growth you're seeing with wrestling cards in the hobby, right? They're bringing wrestlers to Fanatics Fest. You could watch a Monday Night Raw or a SmackDown or whatever, and there's Topps promotion on there talking about cards and things like that. And so I think, more kids and more people are finding out about it. And now you can go to your hobby shop and you can get a box of Topps Chrome or Panini Prism or something like that, which I think is really cool.
Yeah, all great points. I had Gelman on, who's I'm sure
Oh yeah.
and one of the things I said to him is, I don't know why, like when I took my son to these wrestling events, whether it would have been when Panini held the licensing or now with Topps and Fanatics or whoever it may be who holds the licensing, it'd be nice to see them sort of go to these events, or not even have to go, but have product there, or like free promo packs as people come through the turnstiles to attend the event, or even give them to just the kids if they want to even limit them. Like, hey, we can't give them to everybody, but all kids 16 or under, or 12 and under, whatever they deem the cutoff, is going to get a free promo pack from Panini, from Topps of wrestling, to make people aware that, hey, there's, besides those shirts and trinkets, there's cards too, and we're making them, and sort of get that sort of word out there. And he liked it too. He didn't really have an explanation why we don't see more of that. We see it a little bit in certain other sports, even in those sports. Even the other sports can probably do a little more. And when I say sports, I'm really talking about the manufacturers themselves, in partnership with the venues as well, to get these cards in. A kid that comes through that gets handed a pack of wrestling cards said, I didn't even know they made these. I want more of these. Like,
Right.
Why do you think that's something we'll see more of in the future? And why haven't we seen it already? Like, where do you think the disconnect is? There, whose fault is that? I guess maybe.
Yeah, I'd probably say it's probably a mix. You wouldn't talk about fault, but it's probably a mix of the manufacturer, right? Getting those types of packs, right? Because they're looking at it as, okay, what can I get the most bang for my buck, right? And so let's build these boxes out and do all that sort of thing. And so without thinking about the whole accessibility piece, again, which I think Topps and Fanatics is doing it better now with having accessibility to wrestlers at Fanatics Fest. I do think that they may be handing out, some packs and things like that to visitors, and at the national and stuff. I'm sure they'll have some kind of wrestling presence in packs that you can get or redeem or something like that. So I'll certainly be curious around that. But I think the other piece of it is too, is like, even though wrestlers have long signed autographs and, gone to these signings and things like that, I think they haven't really taken the card aspect of it seriously. And really known, because sometimes you would just get cards and there's just a scribbled signature, or it just wasn't really a big focus for them now. But I think now, especially with some of the inscriptions you've seen on cards, and then some of the wrestlers that post the cards on their social media, and so on and so forth, there's starting to get to be more of like an acceptance of like, hey, this is cool, and we're becoming part of the hobby. And then maybe a month or so ago, they had some wrestlers go out to hobby shops and actually, rip some boxes with fans, and they have people come there and they can take pictures and rip boxes and all that. And so I think that that's only helping things to grow and become more mainstream. But in terms of, why they didn't do it in the past, it's super tough to say. I think it's just, the cards and card hobby was still so much like a niche kind of thing, kind of off in the shadows a little bit, and then it's slowly becoming, it's getting a big backer such as Fanatics, to really push that thing mainstream and really be involved in all the sports. And you see, they're wearing patches at WrestleMania that they're going to put into a card now, and so that it allows people to link things of like, saw a patch in the ring at WrestleMania, now patches in card, much as what you saw with like the Topps debut patches in baseball. So I think it's only going to continue to grow. And I think as they come up with new ideas of how to make that connection and get more, event worn items and signatures from people that haven't signed in a long time, because I think that's one thing too, is for a long time, Topps was only getting like the same people to sign over and over and over again. And so, it's like, how many autographs of, Natalia, nothing against Natalia, does somebody really need, or something like that? So that's my thoughts.
Yeah, I agree with you. And also, it seems like the licensing itself, Drake, has changed its hand kind of every 1 or 2 years. So the companies are, you wonder, are they in it for the long haul, or do they know like, hey, we might only have this a couple years, then someone else is going to get it. Maybe we'll get it back down the line. Where I think with your baseballs and football, basketball, hockey's obviously on the upper deck side of the house, but I think they look at those as more long term, 5-10 years, or now in Fanatics' case, 20-year deals.
Mm-hmm.
With wrestling, we haven't seen licensing on those length of deals. So like, even if they wanted to do that, and again, I'm going to sound like I'm sticking up for them a little bit. I guess maybe I am a little bit. But even if they wanted to do that, by the time they really got all the wheels greased and things in motion, they may lose the license anyway, and then someone else has it. So,
Yep.
And maybe when we see a longer term deal, we'll see maybe more so of that, But again, the hobby, the wrestling hobby has grown, like you said, in the last 5 years tremendously. You don't even have to be in it to know that's the case. When you got into the card hobby of the wrestling side, like you said, what was your approach? Were you just collecting the guys that you kind of followed when you were a younger fan? Were you putting sets together? Kind of, how did you attack being, a wrestling collector?
Yeah, so I was really, again, returning back in 2019 and, first learning about the Wrestling All-Stars. I wanted to go back and, get the guys that I liked growing up, right? So it was the Hulk Hogan's and Andre the Giants and the Ric Flairs and the Memphis Connection and Jerry Lawler and, so on and so forth, some other folks from that from that set too. And then, moving on a little bit further, and Bret Hart and Macho Man Randy Savage. And then you get into the 90s and Stone Cold Steve Austin. And I found out that he had a card that he signed. And then there was the 1994 action pack set with, the Undertaker and Macho Man and Randy Savage. And that was, the first cards that they had signed. And, they were, limited to 500 copies a piece, but they're almost impossible to find. And try finding one with a good signature. They're really, really tough. So that was kind of what I was looking into. in terms of that. And then you fast forward a little bit, and then like I mentioned, I learned about that 2014 Topps Chrome set. And I knew I liked, again, as a kid growing up, and then even getting back to the hobby, I knew I love, gold refractors and superfractors and that sort of thing. And so I, was really taking the shotgun approach. And if I would see it, anybody with a gold refractor and it seemed to be priced well, then I would buy it. Right. And I had this huge collection of like 2014 Topps Chrome gold refractors. And then I learned there was a 2015 Topps Chrome set, and I'm picking up those gold refractors. And then the 2020 set came out. And so you're excited about, oh, well, this is new and let's go chase after these. And then there's a 2021 and there's Finest. And then I learned about, okay, well, then there's this, Topps Transcendent collection. And so started getting, some of the first autographs of like Vince McMahon that he had. And then in 2021, they had the Superfractor, the cards that were signed. And so I was chasing after some of those. So it was really just, kind of getting back to my roots of like, what did I like in other sports? And so let's buy these. And it was interesting because it didn't really, it took a long time for that to catch on in wrestling. Because I'll tell you that wrestling collectors and, sometimes for obvious reason, we're all about collecting the females, right? They wanted the female cards with the signatures or ones they had kissed and then signed and, and all that kind of stuff. So wrestling collectors can be a unique bunch sometimes, but, that was kind of the approach to it. And so, oftentimes cards of, Trish Stratus or Charlotte Flair or Becky Lynch or Lita or people like that were outselling people like, The Rock and Roman Reigns and even Hulk Hogan, Stone Cold Steve Austin and that sort of thing. And so it was good for me because I wasn't into really collecting the women. I wanted to get more on the men's side of things. So, like I said, I was just taking the shotgun approach with things and just did that. And then, I like I was when I was a kid, I wasn't buying it because I was like, ooh, this seems like if I buy this for $70, one day I can sell this for $1,000. That wasn't my thought. But again, with everybody coming back in and, supply being so short and demand increasing, because like I said, there weren't as many cases produced of that stuff in 2014, 2015. It's really, really hard to find. Like if you go out right now on eBay and start looking for 2014 Topps Chrome gold refractors of big names like, The Rock or John Cena, people like that, even though they're out of 50, they're like impossible to find, especially in a high grade, because some of the high grade like PSA 10s are like pop 1, pop 2, pop 3. And so it just to finalize answering your question, it was looking at the guys that I grew up and had nostalgia for, but it was also some of the newer folks that newer wrestlers that I was interested in. I was like, well, this Roman Reigns guy is kind of cool. And then, John Cena was a little bit newer, than some of those more vintage guys. And I liked him a lot. And so I got into collecting him some and things like that. So that's it was a mix of old and new, more on the nostalgia side and trying to pick up some of their, cards of different parallels and sets that I liked.
Yeah, of people you followed or had followed, stuff you enjoyed, right? You mentioned like it's not about buying it on Monday and selling it on Wednesday. We've seen that in other sports, even a lot, especially during the COVID crescendo. Do you see less of that in the wrestling hobby space, or percentage wise, or does it happen there along the same lines, where someone is just purchasing something with the full intention, like, hey, I don't love it, I just know I can make a quick buck on it?
Yeah, I'd say it's a mix. I mean, certainly in the last 2-3 years, that people doing that has increased exponentially. And I'll start with people can do whatever they want. It's their cards. What my opinion is shouldn't affect how someone does things. Like even though I may disagree with what's being done, that's the prerogative. But I think what we find a lot in like wrestling cards is people will either publicly or privately, and I'll back up a little bit. Wrestling collectors sometimes didn't even know what they had, right? And so you would sometimes see somebody list like a superfractor or a black finite prism, and they would list it for way under where it should be market value, just because they didn't know for whatever reason. They didn't know what they had. And so then you see somebody, snipe that up, and then they immediately go and list it for probably 5 to 10x market value on eBay. And then it just sits there and it rots away. And I've shared this before with Gelman and with Brett and others, like I really feel for people because there's a lot of people that, that may not have the means and may be scrounging together to, to get that Jey Uso collection or get a, like one of the lesser names or something like that. That's maybe not considered an investable or a flippable type wrestler or whatever. And some of these people have just taken this card and then just go listed at this insane price on eBay. And that really, it's cost prohibitive for that person to buy that card. Like it just doesn't make sense, And so I think I don't know if there's like gatekeeping a little bit or really what it is, but it bugs me a little bit when there's a group of people that go in and just buy stuff for the sole purpose of like, I want to hold this thing hostage or I want to corner the market, and then try to, get a whole lot more money than what I paid for it and stuff. So, but yeah, there's certainly, people that flip their way into bigger cards. And I think, the streams like Whatnot and other selling platforms and all that sort of thing has enabled people to do that. And that's certainly fun, to kind of watch some of those things from time to time, and see that. But yeah, there's definitely flippers and wrestling cards just like there are in all segments of the hobby.
Yeah, no doubt. While we may not collect for the purpose of doing that, like you said, to each their own, right? There's going to be people who that's just their angle. It is what it is, and anytime I've had anyone on and wrestling cards comes up, the one thing I always get from whoever the guest is how great like the wrestling hobby community is, like to help each other out, whether someone's missing a card or searching for something hard to find and kind of be on the lookout for. And we see that obviously in other aspects, baseball collectors, but it's always something that definitely comes up. The camaraderie, if you will, of the wrestling hobby community. What do you attribute that to? Just because it's just a close knit sort of group? Is it as simple as that? What say you there?
Yeah, it's interesting. I think it's just because it's more of a smaller community, and again, there's fewer sets and things, and so you can instantly, whether it's a certain wrestler you collect or a certain type of card, like a parallel or whatever, you can instantly kind of like gravitate to those folks, and you kind of become a little community there. So, sometimes there's like a vintage community, and that group talks a lot and helps each other out. Then there's a modern, ultra modern, and that group stays together, and that sort of thing. But big props to our friend Mr. Gelman, like you talked about before. He put together a big spreadsheet where people sent in like, here's who I collect. And so if I have a card and I'm like, hey, I'm thinking about moving this card, I always go to that spreadsheet first and say, okay, who's a Triple H collector maybe? And I want to go and reach out to those people first. And try to say, hey, you're a collector. I would love for you to have this card. Here's what I want for it. Either say yes or no, right? That's fine. And to me, and I've shared this before, I think it brings me greater enjoyment, like knowing cards are going to a collector or somebody that's going to appreciate them, more so than just sending it off to auction or consignment, which sometimes we have to do, right? It's sometimes it's a lot easier to throw a bunch of cards in a box and send it to Fanatics Collect or to eBay or whatever and just wipe your hands, right? But it's great fun for me to kind of know where all my cards are going and like know who has them and, see their excitement versus just some, random person that wins it in an auction or whatever that may be trying to flip it or may not collect that person or whatever. And so that to me is just it brings me a lot of enjoyment to be able to do that. But it's really funny about the wrestling community is I actually moved some cards to an individual just yesterday, in fact, and he asked me if I would send him a photo. And I used my kitchen table that I use for most of my photos, and he posted on his story and didn't tag me. And I got like 3 direct messages and a text message within like 30 minutes and was like, wow, these are your cards. Very cool, da, da, da. And I'm like, well, how did you know that? And they said, oh, your table. I recognize your table. So it's just neat. Sometimes it feels really big, but other times, like, in that instance, it feels small.
Your kitchen table gave you away, Drake. You're gonna have to change. You're gonna either you're gonna have to put a tablecloth on that, or if it has one, you have to switch it out. But caught by the kitchen table, as they say. That's funny. And again, that's a testament to like the community, how you guys, how everyone knows everyone and what you collect, and you hit it right on the head. There is something to be said when you know someone collects a certain person or athlete, and you can help add one that they don't have. I think it's a two-way street of adrenaline, right? You know, you made their sort of day, and obviously, if their day gets made by adding a card, it's a win-win. And I know the feeling and enjoy it, and you try to you try to do that as we can. So we have another. I don't probably collect him as much as you do, Drake, but a guy I know you collect, who, and we'll talk about this, and I'm sure you'll agree with me. I think's criminally underrated, which is Peyton Manning. I think part of that reason is he played, during the same time period with Tom Brady. And I'm a Steeler fan, so I don't have any direct. I just love Peyton Manning as a person. He's just, while he's not shy, he, unless he has, he's always been funny, even before his post career broadcasting and commercials. Even when he was playing, he was a funny guy, and while he didn't necessarily seek the limelight, he didn't shy away and kind of gave his honest assessment. I've always really admired him as a player and as a person. Even though he wasn't a Pittsburgh Steeler, but he played again. I don't want to say in the shadow, but during the same time period with Tom Brady, and he still won two rings, and maybe have a few more if it wasn't for that meddling Tom Brady. And my Steelers might have another one or two as well as a team. But if you look at the numbers, and even if I took his name off and just say put the numbers up against each other and take the rings out, the 6-2 or whatever, like I make the people think I'm nuts. I as a quarterback, I think he's actually a better quarterback. He just played with a different coaching system, different personnel. I've had other people tell me you're crazy for saying that, Newman, but I'm a football guy. Like I've coached it, I've played it. Um, I think is like I said, underrated. I try to pick up his stuff, and especially on the rookie side, but even stuff that's not rookie cards, it's just maybe low printed numbers. And sometimes for what I get it for, to be blunt honest, is surprises me. Like, wow, that's all that went for. Kind of your thoughts as someone who's even more so, knows the greatness of Peyton.
Yeah, no, for sure. It's all great points. So just kind of background with me on Peyton, right? So I grew up in the Memphis area. I ended up going to school. I'm a Razorback. You can see all the stuff behind me, all the Arkansas stuff. But I was a Tennessee fan growing up. I think, I was a pretty good kid, and the way I rebelled against my parents is they were Arkansas fans, and so I wanted to root against everybody that played against Arkansas. And then my mom was actually a high school teacher, and all of her teacher friends either went to Tennessee or were fans of Tennessee. So like for Christmas and stuff, we'd get together and they'd always be giving me an orange shirt and that whole sort of thing. So that's what caused me really to become a Tennessee fan. And then Peyton Manning, when he came along, I was in my teenage years, and so you're emulating the star quarterback and that whole sort of thing. So I got to go see him play in college and just really liked watching him play. And obviously in the Memphis area, his cards were probably the most accessible. So you walked in the hobby shop and there was Peyton Manning stuff all over the place. So I felt like I could just pick up his cards, pretty much nonstop. So it was easy to build a collection of Manning cards as a teenager. And then he goes onto the Colts, and that was when I was in college, really, for the most part. And then, then he gets injured and finished his career with the Broncos. But, one of the only two players outside of Tom Brady to win a ring with multiple franchises, which I think is really cool. But yeah, just to your point, I mean, and really the reason I collect him is, he's a great guy, great family guy, role model. As much of a superstar as he is, I've got a guy in my Peyton Manning group chat who lives near him in Colorado, and he's showing up to his son's little league games, and he coaches his son's football team, and he's very accessible, just even as busy as he is, right? Just a stand-up guy, family guy, a guy that I really look up to and really appreciate just what he does. But, when you look at it from like a hobby perspective, right, he was long valued more than Brady. And again, that was back when cards were relatively inexpensive. And then, after Peyton got hurt, and then Brady, really, took the like 2012, 2013, I forget the Super Bowl year, but when Brady kind of won that ring, it's like things flipped. And then Brady got a little bit more expensive than Peyton and kind of kept going on and on and on. But, when you look at it, right, I think Peyton would have had at least one more Super Bowl with the Colts, had his special teams defense has not let him down, right? And then you look at Tom Brady, and Tom Brady, phenomenal quarterback. I'll say he's the greatest of all time, right? I think that's really not up for debate. But man, you look at some of those offensive lines that he had. You and I could have won a Super Bowl, but behind those offensive lines, and the defenses, just nasty defenses. And so, I think Brady was helped by having that great support cast. And I think that's why when people get into talking about, who's the GOAT and who's this and who's that, I'm like, gosh, it's a team sport. And while the quarterback is the quarterback, and that's who runs the show, and that's who gets all the accolades and all that kind of stuff, you've got to have a great special teams, and you got to have a great defense, and you got to have some luck to win a whole bunch of Super Bowls. And so that's why, in my opinion, right, like Peyton's regular season not Super Bowls, like most valuable player awards that he has, those speak a lot more to me, because, hey, you had to do that over the course of a season, much more than like, yeah, you maybe made it to the Super Bowl and you were the MVP in the Super Bowl, but that's just one game, right? Yeah, you had to get there, but that's just one game. And so I think when you look at that just from a stat standpoint, what you did kind of cumulatively in the course of the career, and then you go on to the Broncos, right? And then he set the record for most passing touchdowns in a season, most passing yards in a season, which he still has those records. And nobody now.
Not to cut you off, Drake. When he went to the Broncos, people wrote him off. They thought that was like he was coming off the neck injury, had the surgery. Like they thought he was going to flame out there. And quite the opposite, as you just pointed out, happened. He had some of his better years, a few. And like you said, won another ring there. So people who left him for dead, as Lee Corso would say, not so fast, my friend, right? And so exactly. But go ahead.
No, exactly. No, it's certainly a great point, right? And so they left him for dead, and then now you see the quarterbacks that have an extra game to do it, and they're not even sniffing that record. Right. So I think it just speaks to how just great of a quarterback that he was, and then people get in and say, well, his, ring that he won right before he retired in Denver wasn't really because of him. It was based the rest of the team. I'm like, okay, well then you can't have your cake and eat it too. You can't say that, the Patriots won all these rings only because of Brady, right? When it was obviously a team effort, but then turn around and talk out of the other side of your mouth and say, well, with Peyton, he was kind of down and it was the team that won the ring, right? You really have to have it both ways. But I think, just purely from a hobby perspective, I think, there's always going to be, a few guys that really suck up all the value, for the most part, and then everybody else kind of falls in line after that. So I think that's what you're seeing a little bit. And then certainly relevance post-career plays a lot. So I think it's more than just stats, right? It's how often your name's coming up and what you're doing and what you're involved in and, that sort of thing. And I think Peyton has had his moments over the last few years in the hobby where, he's gotten his due. But I think over time, especially now when people really, you start backtracking and think, oh, wow, this quarterback, had a great season. And it's like, yeah, but he wasn't as good as Manning and, or even a Roethlisberger, from your Steelers days, or, some of these other guys that are just all-time greats. I think as time goes on, the hobby and, us as just football fans, we're going to look back and be like, wow, I mean, that era of quarterbacks that we went through, kind of that 2000 to 2020 era, was just absolutely phenomenal. And so I think it's always going to be compared to that. And I think as time goes on, people are going to look back on that more fondly. The last thing I'll say too is when you look at quarterbacks now, I think Patrick Mahomes, phenomenal quarterback. But I think if you put him against some of the defenses that Brady and Manning and some of those guys had to play against, I don't know that he's winning as much as he is right now. So again, it's hard to compare different eras, and we can always play the what if game and what could happen. I love watching Mahomes play. My son's a fan of the Chiefs. That's who he looks up to as a kid, and that whole sort of thing. But you always kind of wonder the what ifs, and what if this guy played in this era? Like what if Peyton played now? Is he as good as he was back then? I have no idea. So anyways.
Yeah, all great points, Drake. It's hard to compare eras, but you pointed out that era of quarterbacks with the Roethlisberger, Manning, Brady, and others. We could probably add Brees and so on and so forth. It might be the one of the greatest eras of quarterbacks in the history of the NFL. And if you put, going back to Manning, like I said, it's criminally. If you even Roethlisberger, and I'm not trying to be a homer here, but if you took their name off the stats and just showed their career stats, didn't say how many rings they did or didn't win, you just put up the numbers and percentages, and you looked, and Brady included, they're all they're in the same sort of ballpark. But obviously, when you win 6 rings, that puts you in a different air, And I get it, and maybe I'm not saying it shouldn't be, but it's from a pure quarterback perspective. Those guys were just as good. Even like you said, you take some of the defenses that Brady had and other supports, that probably the best coaching staff money could buy at that time, at least, right? That the others didn't. I think that makes a huge difference. But just hey, I would have no problem, like the question, like, hey, you got to win this game. You got one quarterback. Manning would be at the top of my list. And Brady's right there too. I'm not trying to, besmirch Brady's name or his accomplishment, but I just think we don't give Manning and even others. You mentioned Roethlisberger, but Manning, especially to me, the more credit. And when you look at the numbers, they speak for themselves. And it might be, I think you touched on it. It might be maybe starting now, but it might be years later when they're sort of not necessarily still getting some attention for post-career stuff, that we just look at the numbers and say, man, why didn't we talk about more of the greatness of Peyton and Manning than we did? Not that it's not talked about, but to me, it should be more. And it's, one of my favorite cards is Manning's Stadium Club rookie. Aesthetically, obviously it's a Manning rookie, and those things are going for like $10-15, and that to me is insane. And I'll buy them all day in that range, and just they're not even for resale. I just love the card. It's one of those cards I can never have. I have 10, I want 11. I get 20, I want 25. And just they go way too cheap. I'm not gonna it's almost crazy not to buy them for the aesthetic reason and for the greatness of Peyton. And so hopefully more people kind of see it. I think it's starting. I think you mentioned that we're starting to see that. And the fact that he stayed active and he's on ESPN and doing stuff with his brother in commercials, and I think that helps. But even if he didn't, when you look at the numbers, they speak for themselves.
Sure, yeah. And just to wrap that up, I think it just goes to show that hobby, relevance and valuation goes beyond just numbers, right? And I think I think Chris McGill, probably his rating system is good. It's like the MVP awards, whatever sport you're in, that's kind of how when you're ranking like the greatest or best of all time, that's a good way to do it. But I argue back with him a little bit on the whole. Okay, well, I value regular season awards a little bit, more than just a single game most valuable player type award. and that whole sort of thing. But yeah, it blows my mind, just to be frank, whenever you see some of these quarterbacks they're exciting to watch. But when you've got guys like Justin Herbert and Joe Burrow and Jaden Daniels, who are, some of their cards are selling more, than any Peyton Manning card has ever sold for. I just scratch my head and I'm going, gosh, like, what, these people that are spending these 6-figure amounts on these cards, like, it just seems like there's only one way for them to go but down. And so, yeah, it crosses my mind a lot.
We see that in baseball too, with some of these Bowman colored autos go for you know, highly regarded prospects,
Yep.
but six, you know, 5-6 figures, and you can get an established Hall of Fame high graded rookie card for that of someone who cemented their legacy, and it's just I scratch my head, probably like you do, and like Jeepers. For that kind of money, there's so many safe bets. I get it. There's the adrenaline rush, the risk, whether we like it or not. I guess that's the form of gambling. Like, I'm going
Yep.
to put this chunk of change out there and take a chance, and hopefully it pays off. With the chance that I could lose my shirt here too. But so I get that. But man, for that kind of money, it's just so many other ways I would go. But again, to each their own, like you said earlier, and what have you. So, but like you, I'm not necessarily a Tennessee fan or a Colts fan, but I'm a Peyton fan, and anytime I can grab some stuff of his for the prices it goes for, it's like a no. To me, it's a no brainer, and I try to do. It's when I go to eBay or any kind of like sales site. It's one of my first searches, just because it's so fun to see what's out there, and for whatever reason what it's only bringing, and I do that. So
No, for sure. And and you mentioned being a fan. Sometimes I wish I was a fan of one of those teams, like hardcore, because there's a guy I know, he'll only buy his Peyton Manning jerseys in his Tennessee jersey. Colts fans only want it in the Colts jersey. Broncos fans only want it, in the Broncos jersey. And I tell everybody, I'm like, I don't care what jersey he's in, I'll buy him. Like, he could be in a Pro Bowl jersey, he could be in in like a pickleball jersey, and I might be interested in it. And so it certainly stretches you thin sometimes.
yeah. Well, at least a little less thinner, because we still get some great deals on them as well, Drake. So you get to travel around for your employment and your job, and we're Facebook friends, so I get to see some of your your exploits and your travels. And you seem to make a point, which I would do too, and I do when I do travel. You travel more than I do, so that's why I'm at. But you always try to make a point that whatever city or town you're in, just to see, the local LCSs or show, kind of speak to that. Is when you're going somewhere, like, do you kind of try to plan that in there based on how much time you may or may not have?
Oh yes, for sure. For me, I love cards, but I value those a lot, but the community aspect is great. And so if I can go, and stop by a local card shop somewhere, and I'm on a trip, it's always great to go in and see folks, and maybe you see them when you're visiting that area, and then you say, hey, I'll see you at the National, right? And it's fun for me because I enjoy just walking through the shop, and I'm not walking in typically. The stuff that I look for is probably not going to be out, sitting in a display case, right? At this point in time. And so, but I enjoy just going and seeing what's out there, and just talking with the shop owner, and just asking how things are going, and what they're selling, what shows they've been into, what things they're looking for. And it's also good to develop that relationship, because then they can keep an eye out, and they go to a show, and they're in Chantilly, or they're at some show on the East Coast, or they're in Dallas or out at Burbank or whatever, and they may see something they know I'm looking for, and then they'll send me a direct message, right, and say, hey, I saw this at the show and I thought of you. And so I think it's great just to maintain those relationships, and just be able to talk cards and look around and visit, and sometimes snap a photo out front, and then you throw it on the social media, and that helps them out from an awareness standpoint, and things like that. So I try to just to do that, just really more from a community aspect, and just develop and try to keep those relationships, which is a lot of fun.
Yeah, no doubt. I call it like being an ambassador an advocate, right? You're promoting the hobby, you're promoting your passion for the hobby, and at the same time, like you said, highlighting the store. Maybe someone sees that and says, "Oh my God, I'm there once a month for whatever reason. I didn't even know about that store. Now I'm going to check it out next trip in." So, I think it's great. Again, that sense of community, right, and getting the word out and that sort of thing, and it makes, even though the hobby's large, as we both know, it makes it feel smaller, right? Those connections, it makes it feel a lot smaller than it actually is. Even though it's growing by the day, it's those kind of, uh, you know, in the trenches kind of relationships that mean so much, and like you said, can pay off dividends both ways, right? Someone remembers, hey, I know you're looking for this, or collect this, I got this in, and vice versa, and
Yep.
you can't put a price tag on that sort of thing. Segueing into the national, for me, and I think I speak for you here, Drake, and I'll let you speak for yourself. It's the week we circle on the calendar every year to try to get there, if not for the whole week, at least a few days. And no matter how many you've been to, I think this coming one will be my sixth or seventh. For as long as I've been in the hobby, I've only been to 6 or 7 nationals, but you always look forward, and the minute it's over, you count down the days to the next one, and it's obviously the cards and acquiring some new cards, but it's again what you kind of talked about. It's the people, events after the show, whether it be a sports event in the town that's holding the national, or just going to dinner with friends and meetups, and if you're in the trade nights and that sort of thing. So it's just a whole event in itself. And what we know the national is today, and even in talking with Dr. Jim, who's been to every one, he'll tell you like the national today is different
Mhm.
than what the first incarnations were and what they were supposed to be. It's evolution of the show itself. For you, kind of speak to the national, kind of what it means, and for you.
Yeah, for me, I mean, you kind of took the words from my mouth, right? The national for me is just getting together with friends, whether it's like, it's a Peyton Manning group chat or a wrestling group chat. There's people that, you only see really once a year, but you talk to them almost every single day. And so they're great friends, and you feel really close to them, and you know what's going on in their life with marriages and kids or job changes or, sickness or something like that. And it's just a great opportunity to get together and go to dinner and talk cards and have group meetups and things. So I really enjoy that. Last year I actually brought a friend with me for his first national, and so
That's cool. That's
he's also going back this year, and I'm trying to convince a couple other friends that they need to go to the national and all that. So that's always fun to me to kind of, because I remember my first national that I ever went to was in 2021. Yeah, 2021. And that was I just remember how excited I was and how just jaw dropping and just, oh my gosh, this place is huge, and what am I going to do to navigate and all that sort of stuff. And so it's like I want them to experience what I experienced, because that to me is like really, really cool. And it's fun for me just to walk around and see all the items on display. Like I love looking at some of the. I think it's typically like a heritage auction that has a big display set up and things. And I think last year they had like the costumes from the Power Rangers and the slippers that Dorothy wore, and and like just that type of stuff to me, just the historical artifacts, and whether it's wrestling robes or baseball jerseys or bats or something like that. That's fun for me just to look around, and then you get to listen into some of the speakers that they bring on stage. That to me is a lot of fun. But really, first and foremost, it's all about the people and getting to see people. And if you come home with a card, or you sell a card or trade a card, I mean that's just the icing on the cake. Like I remember the first year I went to the national, and I was like, okay, I've got to buy these cars. I got to find these cars, and it's not going to be successful if I don't do that. And that quickly changed. Like not long even after I got there, I'm like, forget the cards. Like this is just cool. I just want to go to dinner. I
yeah.
want to hang out. I want to look. I want to touch, see, like that whole sort of thing. And so, I mean, that to me is what the national is really all about.
Yeah, I agree, and it's nice to grab a couple cards when you can. Last year I did better than previous years, where I was always scrambling sort of at the end before I had to head back. Last year I got a card on my list earlier than traditionally speaking, which is nice because it sort of takes that pressure off. But you unless God forbid something bad happens, you really can't have a bad national. Even if you, like you said, even if you don't get all the cards on your list or you don't do as well as you kind of come in, it's all those hanging out with friends and in the chats and even on the show floor itself. Sometimes I gotta watch, like, because I'm a talker, as you know, and sometimes I'm like an hour later I'm like, oh my god, I gotta hustle, and I never try not to cut things short, but sometimes you lose track of time, and especially if I'm not there. I usually am there for the full week, but every once in a while it might be a 4 or 5 day one. I'm like, man, I gotta like really utilize my time, maybe a little more so than if I was here the whole 5 days. I'm only here 4 or 3.5 or whatever
Mhm.
it might be. And I'm glad you talked about the first one, right? So when I went to my first one, which I don't know, was it 2017, 2018? Um, it was in Chicago, and everyone's like, "Oh, John, they're giving you the breakdown. This is what you do." And even when you get in that scouting report, once you walk through those doors, and you kind of
Throw it out
mention it
the window.
yourself, yeah. And I don't care what anyone tells you, it's even bigger than that. It's even bigger than the scouting report or the sneak previews that people are telling you what it's like until you actually get to one. And even now, 6 or 7 in, it still has that. You get that adrenaline rush, and you're like a kid in a candy store. I don't care how old you are. I'm in my 50s, and it's like being a kid in Christmas, and that's what it should be about. And like you said, you're telling people you got to go to the national. You got to go to at least one. Like if you can go to one and say, it was good, but no. If you can do that, all right. You gave it. Don't knock it till you try it, type of
Yep.
thing. But chances are, once you go, it's going to be like, again, that week you circle on your calendar every week. For me, it falls into summer school, which is a little easier to get out of than the regular school year. So my supervisor knows that week I'm going to miss 3 or 4 days because it's really the same. It's the end of July and the front part of August, based on depending how the
Mhm.
days fall. But it's pretty much the same week every year, and it's just there's so many things from events outside the show to the show itself. It's just a great hobby week. You're not going to get that many people a part of the hobby in one place at the same time. That's the event. I know we've had some other great events. I'm not knocking those, but I call the national Super Bowl of the hobby because that's what I feel like it is. We look, if you're a football, even if you're not like even people who are not football fans know the significance and
Mhm.
impact of the Super Bowl and watch the Super Bowl. To me, it's the Super Bowl of the hobby because you just have every aspect of the hobby represented, from collectors, dealers, manufacturers, content creators, everything. Every it encompasses everybody and everything, and it's just something I look forward to every year. I almost didn't go this year. I'll make this quick, and just for me, Chicago, I got to fly. It could be logistically, it's a little tougher, a little more pricier, and so I was kind of on the fence. And my wife, who doesn't, will not go to the national with me. She doesn't care anything about the hobby. She'll go to the national if the city has a beach. So she went to Atlantic City. That's her. That's the prerequisite there. So she knows she's not going to Chicago. So she says, "You're really not going to go?" And I said, "Well, I'm not officially not going yet, but if you ask me today, I haven't made any kind of reservation." This was a few months ago. She goes, "You know what's going to happen, John. If you don't go, you're gonna be miserable. You're gonna,
Mhm.
you know." So it was my wife. I got to give credit where it was due. It was my wife that sort of like, you kind of gotta go, don't you think? Which is funny. You know, that she was the one that says, it was like I had card friends are like, how do you not go in Newman? Like, but it was my wife's hearing her say even that, I think, was the one where the light bulb went on, and like, wow, even my own wife, who doesn't care anything about, is supportive but doesn't care about the hobby, is saying it. And I thought that was funny, and I got to give credit where credit was due. She was the one that kind of pushed me over the edge, if you will.
For sure. Oh, that's great. That's great.
So listen, we didn't cover everything. We're gonna have to have you, as long as you come back. We'd love to have you back on. I don't want to, keep you too long, but again, glad I finally got you on. Again, we won't make it a one-hit wonder. Love to have you back. There's some other stuff we can definitely touch on. And as you know, Drake, the hobby changes so much. We could do this again in a month and fill another hour or two. With no problem, with no script. So for those listening that want to follow you, like, where can they see what you're doing, and if anything you want to share out there, social media wise?
Yeah, thanks, John. So for social media on Instagram, I'm at Drake's_PC. And then on Facebook and X, I'm at Drake McGruder. So that's typically where I do most of my card stuff, but really card stuff would be the Drake's PC account. So feel free to reach out, or if you've got similar collecting interest or have something you think I might be interested in, don't hesitate. So would love to connect.
Is there? I'll put you on this before we kind of wrap it up. Is there, whether it be a Peyton Manning or a wrestling card, is there something you're kind of that's eluded your grasp that you're looking for that you want to share, or not necessarily?
Yeah, I mean, I can. It's kind of funny. So last year around this time, I would have said it was Peyton's Essential Credentials Future Rookie Card out of 7, and then that fell into my lap, and I was totally not prepared for it at the National last year, but I made it happen. And then actually last Friday, there was a Peyton. It's an Ultimate Collection, the NFL logo shield that he also signed as well from 2005, and that got posted by a company name is Acquire. And I was actually driving with my family down to the lake for the holiday weekend, and I got 3 direct messages, and I'm like, what's going on? And they were like, you got to see this. You need this. You got to go get it. And I was like, I'm trying to drive and not run off the road and be careful and all that. So that's probably going to be my big national purchase for the year. So I'm going to have to, I'm getting that. I'm actually going to planning to pick that up at the Nationals. So yeah, I mean, I'm looking forward to get that. There's still a few that elude me a little bit. I'll just share with the group. So I would love to get it's Peyton's 1998 Bowman Chrome Golden Anniversary Refractor. It's out of 5. Those don't come up very, very often. I'm trying to complete his Finest Gold X-Fractor set from 05 and 06 Finest. I've got the 05 and I need the 06. So those are really my 2 main chase cards for Peyton right now at the moment.
So you heard that, everybody. If you can check those off Drake's Need List, reach out to him, and you're not going to find a better, nicer and better Peyton Manning collector. So it's good. We talk about that satisfaction we get from getting someone a card that they're looking for. Right, in this case, you won't find a better guy to get it to. So hopefully some of those. Well, you mentioned the one for sure at the National. That's a big one. The National's already going to be good. It hasn't even started yet, right? Even if you're not sure, right? The worst he can tell you is like he's all set, or maybe he knows. I know other. I think Brett even collects paints too. So whether it's something Drake needs, or maybe he knows someone else who could utilize it. That's the beauty of community right there. So Drake, as always, appreciate you coming on. We'll if you'd like to, we'll do it again as well.
Yes, absolutely. I appreciate you having me, John. I'd love to do it again. So thank you.
All right. Thanks.